Imagine a boardroom in the heart of downtown Toronto where 15 of the most expensive corporate lawyers in the country have spent 6 hours failing at one job. The room smells like stale coffee and quiet panic. 15 men and women with Bay Street credentials, retainers north of $800 an hour, and the best educations money could buy, all of them staring at a $240 million acquisition contract and seeing exactly what their client wanted them to see. Nothing wrong. At the head of the table sat Lachlan Steele, 36 years old, CEO of Steel Pacific Group, a Vancouver-based shipping and logistics empire his grandfather had built from a single cargo boat in 1962. He wasn't yelling. Lachlan never yelled. Yelling was for men who felt threatened, and Lachlan Steele hadn't felt threatened in a very long time. He was tapping a pen against the rim of his water glass. Tap, tap. It was the only sound in the room besides the air conditioning and the shuffling of papers. "Tell me again," Lachlan said, his voice low, "and even why I should sign." The lead attorney, a tightly wound man named Pendleton, adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Steele, we have reviewed the Crow Meridian acquisition package 4 times. The Vancouver terminals, the hideaway routing rights, the container fleet, it all checks out. The environmental clearances are stamped. The union agreements are binding. If you walk away from this deal tonight, Burton Crow sells the Pacific Logistics Corridor to the Singapore Consortium by morning, and we lose the West Coast network we've been building toward for 6 years." Lachlan looked at the window. 40 floors below, the city moved the way cities always moved, oblivious, indifferent, alive. "Burton Crow," Lachlan said quietly, "put 3 of his own competitors out of business in 5 years. Each deal looked clean on paper. Each one ended in litigation." He turned back. "You are all telling me this one is different." A woman named Harrow, the acquisitions counsel, folded her hands. "The numbers support it, sir. We sign tonight or we lose the corridor." Lachlan checked his 13 minutes to midnight. "Find me a reason not to sign," he said, "or nobody in this room has a job tomorrow." The lawyers went back to their papers, 15 heads bent over the contract, 15 expensive pens clicking. They were looking at the document. They weren't seeing it. Adrian Tate adjusted the strap of her bag and reminded herself not to make eye contact with anyone. She was the Japanese interpreter. She had been hired 3 days ago through a freelance agency, brought in specifically for the addendum, a 12-page Japanese language annex attached to the English main agreement, covering the joint operational terms with Tanaka Maritime Group, Crow's Japanese partner on the deal. Her job was to sit at the far end of the table, translate when asked, and otherwise be invisible. She was good at invisible. She'd had years of practice. At 27, Adrian had learned that invisibility was the only armor available to a woman in her position. The daughter of a man who had died in federal prison 2 years ago, 3 months after losing his appeal. The former third-year law student who had walked away from the University of Toronto with $22,000 in debt and 2 years of coursework left to finish, because the money had run out and someone had to pay for her younger brother, Niall's medical bills. 14 years old, Niall was still waiting for a bone marrow match that hadn't materialized. She had 4 jobs. Interpreting was the one that paid the best. She settled into her chair at the far end of the table, opened the Japanese addendum, and began reading through it quietly while the lawyers argued in English at the other end of the room. She was not supposed to read ahead. She was supposed to translate when called. But Adrian's brain didn't work like that. It never had. It read in parallel, English and Japanese simultaneously, cross-referencing the way a machine might, except faster, because the patterns were already mapped inside her. It was the same skill that had put her at the top of her first-year law cohort. It was the same skill nobody had ever paid her for, because she'd never finished the degree. She was halfway through the addendum when she stopped. She read the clause again, then again. Her hands went still on the page. The clause was in Section 9 of the Japanese Annex, tucked between a standard arbitration agreement and a boilerplate indemnification schedule. In English, the main contract described the environmental clearances as unconditional and irrevocable. The Japanese Annex said something different. In the Annex, the clearances were subject to a reversionary condition, a clause that stipulated if any environmental regulatory action was initiated by a federal or provincial authority against the acquired terminals within 60 months of the transfer date, all physical assets would revert to the seller at the original purchase price, while the buyer, Lachlan Steele, retained full legal liability for remediation costs and regulatory penalties. Adrian set down the page. She thought about what initiated meant, not proven, initiated. A phone call from an inspector. A file opened, that was enough. She thought about the phrase, regulatory action. She thought about the environmental clearance stamps the lawyers had been waving around all night. She thought about a case study she had read in her second year of law school about a company that had sold 3 contaminated industrial sites under almost identical contract language, and the buyers who had spent a decade in litigation afterward. Crow Meridian. The seller's company was Crow Meridian. She looked at the environmental clearance certificate spread across the table, dated 6 weeks ago, signed by a federal inspector named R. Caldecott. She had seen that name 8 months ago in an article about a federal investigation into a bribery scheme involving industrial site inspectors in British Columbia. The article had been brief. She remembered it because she had been reading everything related to environmental law that week, trying to understand the regulations that had supposedly applied to her father's company. R. Caldecott was one of the inspectors named. The investigation had been ongoing. Adrian looked at the clock on the wall, 11:52. Don't, she told herself. You're the interpreter. You translate words. You don't give legal opinions. You don't interrupt closing arguments. The agency coordinator had been clear. These are important clients. Be professional. Be quiet. Do your job. She thought about her father. Her father had signed a document he didn't understand. Not because he was careless. Because his own business partner had stood in the room and told him it was fine. And he had trusted that, and the document had not been fine, and the partner had walked away clean while her father went to prison for fraud he hadn't committed. He died there. 2 years ago. She had held his hand through a phone receiver. She thought about Niall, about the transplant bills, the stack of invoices on her kitchen table in Scarborough, organized by due date because that was the only way she could look at them without her chest seizing up. She thought about the $800 she was owed for tonight. Then she thought about $240 million and a clause in a contract that 15 lawyers with $800 hourly rates had not read, because they could not read Japanese. She set down her pen. She stood up. "Excuse me," Adrian said. 15 heads turned. The silence was immediate and absolute. At the head of the table, Lachlan Steele looked up. His eyes found her at the far end of the room. The woman he had registered only peripherally, the interpreter, the one with the bag over her shoulder, and the frayed cuffs on her blazer and the careful, quiet way of sitting that told you she had been invisible in rooms like this for a very long time. He looked at her the way a man looks when he sees something he didn't expect. "Yes," he said. The Japanese addendum, Adrian said, her voice steadier than she felt, contains a reversionary clause that is not reflected in the English main agreement. "Who is she?" Harrow said, already frowning. "The interpreter," Pendleton said. "This isn't." "Let her speak." Lachlan's voice was quiet, final. Adrian walked the length of the table. She placed the open addendum in front of Pendleton and pointed to Section 9, Paragraph 4. This clause says that if any environmental regulatory action is initiated, not ruled on, not proven, initiated, against the terminals within 5 years of the transfer date, all physical assets revert to Mr. Crow at the original purchase price. Steel Pacific retains full remediation liability. The room was silent. "That's standard risk allocation language," Harrow said carefully. "It isn't in the English contract," Adrian said. "Section 12 of the English agreement describes the environmental clearances as unconditional. That word does not appear anywhere in the Japanese annex. The two documents contradict each other. Under Japanese contract law, the more specific document governs. The annex is more specific." She placed a second page on the table. "The clearances are signed by an inspector named R. Caldecott. There is a federal investigation currently ongoing into inspectors in the BC region who accepted payments for expedited clearances. Caldecott is named in that investigation. If his certification is invalidated as part of that proceeding, which would count as a regulatory action, the reversion clause triggers automatically. Mr. Steele would own the liability and nothing else." The silence stretched. Pendleton was the first to move. He pulled up his phone, his fingers suddenly clumsy, and started typing. Lachlan had not looked away from Adrian. "How do you know about the Caldecott investigation?" he asked. "I read the news," she said. A beat. "And you know Japanese contract law?" "I was in law school." She stopped. "I left before finishing." "But you kept reading." "I kept reading." Lachlan looked at Pendleton. "Check it." Yes, I'm checking." Pendleton's face had gone the color of old concrete. "The Federal Registry, the investigation is listed as active. Caldecott's certifications are under administrative review pending the outcome. He looked up. If the review finds against him, any clearances he issued in the last 2 years are void. The room began to understand what it had almost done. They aren't selling us a logistics corridor, Lackland said. His voice was calm, which was somehow worse than if he had shouted. They're selling us a liability wrapped in paperwork. The moment we take title, Adrian said quietly, we own the environmental remediation costs and the regulatory penalties. The vessels, the terminals, the routing rights, all of it reverts. We'd be paying $240 million for the cleanup bill. Lackland picked up the gold fountain pen from the table in front of him. He did not sign the contract. He set the pen down very carefully and pushed the document away. Pendleton, he said, you and your team are done for the evening. Leave your files. He stood up. At his full height, he was imposing in the way that people who are genuinely in charge always are, not aggressive, just certain. He looked at Adrian. You, stay. Everyone else left. The room went quiet in a different way after. Not the taut, panicked quiet of before, but something looser. Adrian stood at the end of the table with the addendum still open in front of her, her heart knocking steadily against her ribs. Lackland walked toward her. He stopped on the other side of the table. What's your name? He asked. Adrian Tate. How long have you been interpreting, Adrian? 3 years. How long ago did you leave law school? 4 years. He studied her, not the way men in boardrooms usually looked at her, through her, past her at whatever was behind her. He looked at her the way she looked at contracts, like he was reading what was actually there. You knew when you stood up what would happen if you were wrong, he said. Yes. But you stood up anyway. Adrian thought about her father, about a room a lot like this one, 8 years ago, with a man who should have spoken and didn't. Yes, she said. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a card and a money clip. He peeled off a stack of bills, easily more than she'd make in 2 shifts, and placed them on top of the addendum. Take the rest of the night, he said. I'll have someone call you tomorrow with a number. What kind of number? A salary. She stared at him. I'm an interpreter. You were, he said. Tomorrow you'll be something else. He held her gaze steadily. That's if you want it. She looked at the money on the table. She thought about Niall's transplant fund. She thought about rent. She thought about what it felt like to sit at the end of a table for 3 years and translate other people's important words into careful, invisible language while the person who should have been in the room sat in a prison cell that eventually became a grave. I want it, she said. His name was Bertrand, and he was at her door at 7:45 the following morning. A trim man in his 60s with the deliberate calm of someone who had spent decades working for someone who moved fast. He handed her a garment bag and a leather portfolio. Mr. Steele doesn't make calls he doesn't intend to follow through on, Bertrand said. You have a meeting at 9. I suggest you read the file on the way. She read the file in the car. By the time they reached the tower on Bay Street, she had a working understanding of Steel Pacific's acquisitions framework, its 3 existing Pacific terminal agreements, and the name that kept appearing as the internal champion for the Crow Meridian deal. Morris Whitlock, head of acquisitions. She had a feeling about Morris Whitlock. The same low-frequency unease she got when 2 documents disagreed with each other, and someone had decided that only one of them needed to be read. Lackland's office occupied the corner of the 29th floor, and had the kind of view that reminded you the city was full of people who would never see it from this angle. He was standing at the window when Adrian was shown in. He turned when she entered, and she had the passing, inconvenient thought that he looked different in daylight. Less like the controlled force from the previous night, and more like a man who carried something heavy and had learned to carry it quietly. Sit, he said, and then, before she could arrange herself, your father was Harold Tate. She went still. The Lakeshore Meridian case, Lackland said, 2019, corporate fraud conviction. He was sentenced on the testimony of his business partner. He slid a folder across the desk. I looked into it last night. You looked into me. It wasn't quite an accusation. I look into everyone I'm considering hiring. He watched her. His partner's name was in the case file. It took me 11 minutes to find the connection. Adrian opened the folder. She saw the business registration documents, the court transcripts, the name she had spent 4 years trying not to think about too directly, because thinking about it too directly made her feel something she couldn't afford to feel while she was still in the middle of survival. Burton Crow. Burton Crow had been her father's partner in a small logistic consultancy. He had embezzled through the company's accounts for 2 years. When the auditors came, he provided testimony that positioned her father as the architect of the scheme. Her father went to prison. Crow walked away with a settlement and a clean record, and eventually built Crow Meridian into a $240 million trap for the next man who trusted him. He destroyed your family, Lackland said. Then he tried to destroy mine. The room tilted slightly. What do you want? Her voice was steady. It always was when she needed it to be. The same thing you want, Lackland said. To take everything he built on lies and dismantle it legally, completely, and publicly. I can't do that with lawyers who don't read Japanese addendums. He leaned forward. I need someone who sees what's actually there, not what they're told to see. She knew who Lackland Steele was. She knew the weight that came with his family name. She knew this wasn't a simple arrangement. She thought about her father's file in that folder. She thought about Niall. I have conditions, she said. He raised an eyebrow. I work within the law, entirely. I don't want to know about anything that isn't above board, and if I find anything that isn't, I report it, including anything internal. Agreed. My salary reflects the value of what I did last night, not what you think an interpreter earns. I was going to offer you $280, he said. I'll make it $300. She hadn't expected that. She kept her face even, and I want access to every document related to the Crow Meridian deal, including whatever Morris Whitlock generated. A pause. Why Whitlock specifically? Lackland asked carefully. Because his name appears 14 times in the acquisitions file as the internal advocate for this deal, and not once did he flag the addendum discrepancy. He has a law degree from Osgood Hall. Anyone with a law degree from Osgood Hall knows how to read a reversionary clause. Lackland was quiet for a long moment. Get started, he said. She found it in 11 days. Whitlock had been careful. He was the kind of careful that looked like thoroughness. Layers of documentation that created the appearance of due diligence while directing attention away from the things that actually mattered. He had buried the addendum discrepancy under 4 additional contract riders he had drafted himself, none of which the legal team had questioned because he had drafted them. But he had made one mistake. He had used a personal email account to forward a copy of the addendum to an address that Adrian traced, through 3 layers of registration, to a numbered company in Nova Scotia. The numbered company held a maintenance contract with Crow Meridian. The maintenance contract paid out monthly retainers. Whitlock had been on Crow's payroll for 22 months. Adrian was in her office at 11:15 on a Tuesday when she found the payment trail. The building was quiet. The city outside was the particular shade of dark that Toronto gets in November, when the lake wind comes in cold and everyone walks a little faster. The door opened. Lackland was holding 2 containers of soup from the place down the street that stayed open late. You need to eat, he said, the way he said most things, simply without decoration. I found it, Adrian said. He set the soup down and came around the desk to look at the screen. She walked him through it, the email, the numbered company, the maintenance contract, the monthly payments, the timeline. 22 months. Starting 2 months before Whitlock first proposed the Crow Meridian acquisition in an internal memo. Lackland straightened up slowly. His jaw was very tight. He was inside the whole time, Lackland said. He didn't just push for the deal, Adrian said. He structured the due diligence process to miss the addendum. He assigned the Japanese documentation review to a junior associate who didn't speak Japanese. There was no oversight failure, it was engineered. And the closing, that was Crow testing whether Whitlock had done his job. Yes, she has more. She pulled up a second file. I went back to the Lakeshore Meridian case, to the original audit documents. The auditor who filed the report that triggered the fraud investigation, the one that named my father as the primary suspect. She pointed to the screen. The audit firm was engaged by Crow through an intermediary, the same numbered company in Nova Scotia, different era, same structure. The room went very still. He's been doing this for a long time, Lackland said. He sets up the fraud, engineers the audit, points the finger at whoever is standing closest, and walks away. Adrian's voice was steady, because she was not going to cry in this office. She had made that decision 4 years ago. My father was standing closest. Lackland looked at her for a long moment. What do you want to do with this? He asked. Not what he wanted to do, what she wanted. She had thought about this for 4 years. In the theoretical way, you think about something you don't have the evidence to act on. Now she had the evidence. The RCMP Financial Crimes Unit, she said. I've already prepared the package. It's everything: the numbered company, the payment trail, the addendum discrepancy, the full connection to the Lakeshore Meridian case. It's a complete file. She looked at him. I want Crow in court. I want the public record corrected. I want my father's name in print next to the word exonerated. Lachlan nodded once. Send it, he said. They sent it that night. Maurice Whitlock was arrested at his home in Oakville the following Thursday morning. He cooperated with investigators within 48 hours, providing documentation of every transaction and communication between himself and Crow Meridian, going back to the beginning of their arrangement. He also provided something Adrian hadn't known to look for: records showing that Burton Crow had been aware of the RCMP investigation into the Caldecott certifications for 4 months before the deal's closing date. He had known the clearances were under review. He had structured the addendum specifically to ensure that the liability would transfer the moment Steel Pacific signed. He had been planning it for a year. The charges came down 3 weeks later: wire fraud, securities manipulation, criminal breach of trust, and filed separately by the Federal Public Prosecution Service after a review of the Lakeshore Meridian records: obstruction of justice and fraud in connection with the original conviction. The correction to the public record ran in the Globe and Mail on a Wednesday. Adrian read it at her desk in her office, with her name on the door. She read it twice and then set the paper down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and looked out the window at the city below. Her brother called that afternoon. He had seen it online. Dad would have thought this was funny, Niall said. The interpreter getting the conviction. I'm not an interpreter anymore, Adrian said. What are you now? She looked at her nameplate, at the view, at the file on her desk, the latest in a growing stack of work that was entirely, unambiguously hers. I'm figuring it out, she said. It was December by the time the acquisition of Crow Meridian's legitimate assets closed. Under entirely different terms, brokered at a fraction of the original price, with Steel Pacific purchasing only the assets that cleared independent environmental review. The Halifax terminals, 2 of the container vessels, the Haida Gwaii routing rights, renegotiated directly with Tanaka Maritime once the Japanese partners understood that Crow had been misrepresenting the deal to them as well. The night the deal closed, the office was quiet. Adrian was still at her desk at 9 when Lachlan came in with a bottle of wine she suspected cost more than her monthly grocery budget. We should mark the occasion, he said. She turned her chair to face him. The city was bright and cold outside, and she was tired in the way you're only tired when you've been carrying something for a very long time and you've finally set it down. I've been waiting, she said, for you to tell me this was temporary. He poured 2 glasses and set one in front of her. Why would it be temporary? He asked. Because I was the tool you needed, she said, and she hated saying it because it sounded smaller than the truth, but it was the truth she'd been living with. You needed someone who could read the addendum. The addendum is read. Crow is in custody. The deal is done. Usually that's when the consultant gets a check and a handshake. Lachlan set down his glass. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her that first night across the boardroom table. The way that made her feel like she was being read rather than assessed. You reorganized my entire acquisitions review process, he said. You identified 3 other contracts with discrepancies my team had missed. You built the framework that caught Whitlock before he cost this company another deal. You are not a tool, Adrian. You are the reason this company functions differently than it did 4 months ago. She didn't say anything. I also, he continued, quieter, would like to take you to dinner. Not as your employer. As a person who has been wanting to ask you since approximately the night you told 15 lawyers they had nearly signed away $240 million to a man with a criminal structure, and they should probably feel embarrassed about that. Something eased in her chest. A tension she'd been holding so long she had stopped registering it as tension. That was not how I phrased it, she said. It was the implication. She laughed, the full unguarded sound of it filling the quiet office in a way that surprised her. Dinner, she said. Friday, he said. Friday, she agreed. He brought her somewhere that mattered, which she hadn't expected. Not a restaurant designed to impress, but a small place in Kensington Market where the tables were close together, and the food was simple and very good, and nobody recognized him. He'd been going there since he was 22, he said, before Steel Pacific was anything more than a regional outfit with 3 boats and a lot of debt. They talked about her father, about his grandfather, about what it felt like to build something and be afraid of losing it, about what it felt like to watch someone else tear down what your family made and call it business. Over dessert, he reached into his jacket pocket and set a small folded document on the table. She looked at it without touching it. What is that? Open it. Simple language, no legalese. She noticed he had done that deliberately. An offer of partnership. Not employment, equity. 15% of Steel Pacific Group's acquisitions division. She stared at the page for a long time. This is extraordinary, she said. So is finding the one clause that changes everything, he said. In a 12-page Japanese addendum, in a room where nobody else thought to look. She looked up at him across the small table, in the warm light of the restaurant, in the city her father had loved, and the country that had failed him, and then, finally, corrected itself. I have a condition, she said. He smiled. A real one, the kind that took over his whole face and made him look younger. You always have conditions. I want my brother's medical costs covered under the company's extended benefits. The transplant, the follow-up, all of it. Done. And I want the partnership agreement reviewed by independent counsel before I sign it. Obviously. She picked up the pen he'd placed beside the document and looked at it, and then at him. You know, she said, the last time someone put a contract in front of me and said it was straightforward, I found a reversionary clause in the addendum. There's no addendum, he said. I had it drafted in one language on purpose. Smart, she said. She signed. Niall got his transplant match 4 months later. He called her from the recovery ward, still groggy from the anesthesia, to tell her the nurses must think she was very important because the billing department had already filed everything as covered. I know someone, Adrian told him. Is he good? Niall asked. She looked at the city outside her office window, at her name on the door. At the Globe and Mail correction she'd framed and hung on the wall where she could see it every morning. Her father's name in print, the word that had taken 4 years and 1 Japanese addendum to finally appear. He reads the whole contract, she said, every page. That's the right answer, Neil said. Burton Crowe was convicted on 7 counts. He is currently serving 12 years in a federal correctional facility. Maurice Whitlock cooperated fully with prosecutors and received a reduced sentence. He will not work in finance again. Harold Tate's conviction was officially set aside by the Ontario Court of Justice in the spring. The correction ran nationally. His daughter keeps the clipping on her office wall. She says it's a reminder that the most important document is always the one nobody thought to read.